For any client moving from a legacy system, various legacy systems with a single entity or multi-entity migration, what are some of the gotchas, the challenges that maybe they don't know to watch out for?
Okay, that's a great question. So when we got started, we realized there are many ways to destabilize a migration. There are so many ways to get this so wrong. And in our methodology, it's funny, I have a whiteboard that's up on my wall, and it has on it, and I've had this information up for 5.5 years, and it talks about the sources of error. And I have it on the wall because no matter how many hundreds of times we do this, we are always wary of how error can be introduced into a migration, or it may already be there. So I'll go through some of the sources of error now. So we have extraneous information, meaning that the data that you're bringing in is actually too much. It's not what you need. And so when the validation occurs, the numbers are varying because you have too much information in the system, and it's not all right. You have things like non-adding components. You have missing information from the reports being run. You have external transactions that are happening in other places that might be muddling the data that you think you're migrating. So a lot of times when we are doing our historical migrations, we'll see that a variance is occurring in a trial balance validation exercise. And it's because some well-meaning bookkeeper didn't realize that they put a test transaction in on a certain date in our campaign in another place. And now it's throwing off the migration because we're not able to see it and we're not able to recognize it. A lot of times we also have programming errors or transform errors in the data itself. You've got incompatible Intacct configuration settings that can introduce variances. You have reference information duplication where you're loading information 2 or 3 times and you're not really paying attention to it. Now, fortunately, Intacct has done an amazing job of adding something called an offline queue that you can now look at, but that wasn't always there. So you have to be very, very meticulous about how you introduce data to the system. And then, of course, we talked about this a little, but we can talk about it some more. The 9th one is incongruent validation reports. This is where you've assembled a series of reports that you're going to use to check your system, but guess what? They're not quite right because they may be from the system itself, or maybe you're using a series of reports that have been somehow massaged or added outside of QuickBooks. So we come across companies that will provide a separate set of augmented reports outside of their legacy system to their investors or to their stakeholders. And for whatever reason, they ended up using that same validation standard to try to judge the migration. And it ends up breaking and having things be very, very wrong or seem that they were wrong, even though the migration itself is fine. So there are quite a few sources of error, and those are just the ones that you can track. What we found in systems like QuickBooks Desktop is that there are actually 6 migration error types that will go through completely undetected, depending on the stability of QuickBooks. And so our process is designed to find those as part of our standard extraction and validation process. We actually are able to determine if the migration is going to be stable long before we even check it. And these are just things that we've learned over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times of doing it. And so we don't expect people to know it. I don't know that it's worth necessarily broadcasting it, but you know what? If you're going to go through this process, just be aware. There are so many ways that introduced error can be introduced that may be detectable or undetectable. So trust your eyes, but also trust your process, whatever that's going to be.
Wonderful share. Thank you, Hugh.